Thank you so much for coming, Alain, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here. I know that you're doing a very important work here on issues that are crucial for us. And what I would like to do tonight is try to make links between what we can live in a district, in a specific place we live in, and the financial globalization, the whole historical context we're in. And at the end, I'll try to focus more on New Brunswick after having made a travel in all kind of jurisdictions we're not really used to talk about, but that are instrumental. We're not used to talk about them, these jurisdictions, even though they are instrumental in the global finance. Sometimes I'm asked, well, you studied in philosophy, why are you interested in tax havens? I mean, how did you come to work on that? It's interesting to see that tax havens are so important. It's so a major issue, even though we don't talk a lot about it, and certainly not enough. That they influence, they affect the words we use commonly to talk about politics. Like if you have when we have sort of the reflex to talk about politics, we use the knowledge we have about what is a border, law, crime, sovereignty, a country, a nation, and so on and so forth, to talk about issues. But now the problem is so huge that it forces us to change the definition of the words we have when we think about politics. The notion of sovereignty, of state, of border, of crime, of corporation change because of that evolution of capitalism and of the global finance. And this is what I would like to talk about. And it's very interesting when we're involved in political thinking, political concepts. And mainly, the definition we give of tax, the idea is to talk about tax havens. And because these countries are a major concern in the global finance and the geopolitics nowadays. And commonly we know about them, at least because we saw them in Hollywood movies. It will be like the most naive or the first relation we could have with the notion, a movie of James Bond or whatever will be about Switzerland, about Luxembourg, about the Bahamas, the Bermudas, the Cayman Islands, Singapore. So we kind of know that these jurisdictions exist because we see them in novels from John Grisham or Hollywood movies or even comic strips. And it says already something. It says that in the plots of movies, directors have to mention them in order to make the characters realistic. Because if you want to show a drug dealer or a corrupt politician, you must consider that this character has knowledge about account in Switzerland or whatever, banks in the Bahamas. And it is so because the public more or less has an instinctive idea of that network of countries that allow corporations, politicians, arms dealers, drug dealers to manage their wealth. So this is and if we go deeper into the subject, normally when you talk to people that were working at the OECD or journalists, like there's a consensus to say that tax havens are jurisdiction in which, first thing, some structure, some players, some investors don't pay tax. This is the obvious definition. It's a place in which you don't pay tax. So there's almost no tax in the Bermudas on certain activities. The other point is about law. There's no such thing as law. It's not only about tax, it's about law. If you cannot hire children if you have a factory, but in Bangladesh you can. If you have ships here related to transport, you must respect some constraints, some rules, but in Liberia you don't. If you manage the earnings of the middle class of your country, you cannot do whatever you want with that money of the people you have as clients, but in the Cayman Islands you may. So the idea of tax haven is a country, a jurisdiction like the Bahamas, like the St. Kitts and Nevis, like the Malta Republic, in which law disappear. Our law is like if you look things in a photographic point of view, a metaphor, it's like the negative of a constitutional and traditional state. In Liechtenstein, you'll have a law that allow the opposite of what you find in Germany. In the Bermudas, you have laws that are the negative of the laws in the US, and so on and so forth. So law is like a glove that you could reverse. They just work upside down. So, and if you look at the law, for instance, in Liberia or the Bahamas, about a company that you may create there, it will be written, anybody can manage the company, the board anybody can be member of the board, these members can remain anonymous, the board may be represented by any lawyer, they may manage anything, everywhere, in any way they want. And so, it's the slogan you heard in Paris in May '68, interdit d'interdire. It's the slogan, that slogan, but in a morbid way. It's not possible to forbid anything. The third thing is opacity. It's very difficult to know what's happening in the tax havens. Who's there? Like if you think, let's imagine you're in a country where a family owns, I don't know, gas stations, a refinery, woods, a mill for furniture, trucks, newspapers, and that company would sell in an artificial manner all its assets to a Bermuda trust. Well, you don't know what's happening in that trust. You cannot know it because the laws in Bermuda don't allow anybody, journalists, governments, to know what's happening under that law. So it's the laws on opacity. So you don't pay tax, you can do whatever you want, and nobody can know what's happening in that specific jurisdiction. And the last thing is that nothing happens. Let's say that this company has access to forests, cut woods, trees. The company here will sell the trees to the other company in Bermudas. In the Bermudas, the company will sell then the goods to their clients so that the profits are registered in the tax haven where no taxes are paid. Well, this is only accountability writing. Actually, the wood will remain in the country where it was cut. You won't send the wood there so that it can be afterward redistributed elsewhere to clients. Nothing happens there. I mean, if you ever traveled to the Barbados, the Bermudas, you didn't see any like commercial or industrial activities, even though these countries are among the most powerful of the world on a theoretical level. You only saw a few Canadian banks, that's it. Because you have banks and lawyers that register, like in a line on a file, names of company without, even though these companies have no physical presence. It's just about fiction allowed by the law. So this is how we could describe a tax havens, knowing that in these shadow jurisdictions nowadays, between $21 trillion and $32 trillion are managed. This is 21 with 12 zeros, at least, according to James Henry from the Tax Justice Network USA. He's a former employee of McKinsey, okay, and he established that it was approximately the amount of money that is managed in tax havens. So this is half of the world money supply that is managed in those countries where you pay no tax, everything is allowed, you cannot know what's happening, and actually nothing is happening physically. This is like the basic description and definition you may give of a tax haven. But I find other definitions more relevant. For instance, Nicholas Jackson will say there are libertarian states. There are states where you can do whatever you want, and there are states that exist to neutralize states. There are like negative states. States that exist to allow people not to be constrained by any state. You'll have Richard Gordon, a former employee of the IRS. He did a report for the Carter administration in January 1981, just a few days before Carter left office. And the definition Gordon gave in his report was a tax haven is a country considered so by those who use it. I like that definition. What does it mean? It means that when you have financial flows that are not, that doesn't fit with the economic reality of the country, it may mean that the country is used by wealthy corporations, wealthy individuals to avoid constraints elsewhere in the world. This is a definition I like. But another one that would be I think the most relevant is, I sort of worked on it myself, but it was from what Margarett Vestager said 2 years ago now, I think, as a European commissioner related to competition in the case of Apple in Ireland. And I mean, the European Union is not meant to target and tackle tax havens, even though, because there are a lot inside the Europe. But she's a woman that decided to use whatever she has as legal tools to try to stop the use of tax havens by big corporations, and she did it inside Europe, saying, and it was sort of a definition, that Ireland allowed Apple to concentrate all, in a theoretical manner, in a legal manner, all its European assets in order to pay only in the country of Ireland all the taxes it owes to every European countries outside Ireland. So, and she said, Ireland abuses of its right to legislate. This is a perfect definition of a tax haven. And we could say the same thing with the Bermudas. And we have that in Harold Crook's movie documentary, The Price We Pay. You see the representative of Starbucks saying to MPs of London, of the United Kingdom, Starbucks doesn't make money in the UK. And it's not that the clients of UK drink the same cup of coffee all day long so that they don't make money. Is that they manage to shift profits abroad so that they can really legally say to the government, yes, I have a lot of cash flow, but I have to pay invoices at the end of the year to my Bermudian subsidiary so that I cannot make profit inside the UK. So the Starbucks company in the UK doesn't pay taxes because it doesn't officially make money there. And the same thing with Google, who pays roughly 2% taxes in the world each year. Because jurisdictions are abusing with their right to legislate. And how can we figure that out? When you look at the law, like any structure, any entity, economic entity, is created by law. Any kind of organization is created by law. You can have a non-profit organization due to the law, thanks to the law. You can have a small business, you can have a big enterprise, and it's always the law that will say which kind of organization you may create within the jurisdiction. So, if you go to the Bahamas, the Bahamian government will tell you you may create in the Bahamas an exempted company, let's say, or an international company, or a bank, or a trust. Well, let's stick to the exempted company. So you have a law that says an exempted company may be created and have advantages. Well, it's the description, pay no taxes, has no obligation to disclose information about who manages the company, how much money they manage, which are their assets. They don't know. There's a total opacity, no taxes. At the condition, and it's in the law, that exempted company has no activity on the territory of the Bahamas. So if we don't see you, you may create an exempted company. But if you sell a fish on the corner of a city, in a city, you'll pay tax, and you won't be able to create that type of company. You'll create another type of company that pays taxes. So what does it mean? It's a subtle form of political interference. Because the law in the Bahamas is as big geopolitically as the city of Bathurst. It's just a small country, a tiny country. So the Bahamas, the law, the sovereign authority, political authority of the Bahamas, voted a law saying that they may legislate on the way capital is managed worldwide, but on their own territory. Because they vote explicitly on businesses, on activities that don't occur on the territory on which they have sovereignty. So what does it mean on the other side of this organization, like let's say in Canada? Well, you may have a company in Canada saying to the CRA, Canadian Revenue Agency, the government, well, I had some assets maybe, or I'm connected with a company that is created in the Bahamas. I created an exempted company. We could illustrate it as a box, let's say, like to put shape a metaphor, like a box, in which we put financial assets, stocks, debts, all kind of things. We put the cover on, and this box is related to the Bahamian law. So it's not related to the Canadian law. We have connection with that company, we created it. But what's in that box is supervised by the Bahamian government and is related to their law. So you have no say on what is happening in that box. And what you could find in that box. You don't have access to what you have in that box. It's the Bahamian government that take care of that. And the Bahamian government says, well, do whatever you want with that box, I just don't want to see it. So it's a bit like if the invisible hand of Adam Smith could, with his nails, go between the countries and create sort of a financial buffer. I wouldn't say illegal, but illegal. Like an anemic situation in which you have at least $21 trillion managed. And no government have access to that. This is the problem is there. So our governments are weak in supervising multinational corporations, but companies are able to bypass the small amount of constraints they face being in the jurisdiction they are in, and to circumvent the fiscal and the legal system in order to register assets and create corporations that are supervised by no public authority that could be defined in a serious manner. So this is a big problem, and it occurs easily in a world dominated by major important financial institutions and multinational corporations. Because a multinational isn't a company. It doesn't exist as such. On a legal point of view, a multinational corporation doesn't exist. It's not a legal subject. What exists is a network of subsidiaries. Like Monsanto doesn't exist. McDonald's doesn't exist. ExxonMobil doesn't exist. What exists is a network of hundreds of subsidiaries created worldwide. And they are independent on a legal basis. Like Bombardier may create a subsidiary in Brazil, and this subsidiary is independent on a legal point of view from this company, this Canadian company. And if they create a subsidiary in the Barbados, which is likely the case, well, this company in the Bermudas, or the Bahamas, or the Barbados, is also independent from the other, so they can send invoice to each other. They can borrow money with interests. If they become totally crazy, they can sue each other. And the idea is that what we call the multinational corporation, which is a group, we say often a group, or an empire when we become poetic, it's a group of structures. The idea is that the global amount you present at the annual assembly of your shareholders is only an addition of all what the structures have independently. But this amount of money is related to no proper bank account that would belong to one company, which would be the multinational corporation. It says it, a multinational corporation. It exists in multiple jurisdictions. So what do, these subsidiaries? Well, they send invoice to each other. Half of the world financial transactions are intra-group, are related to the inner activity of a single group. And it's about shifting profits where they won't be taxed. And putting the responsibility of some activities in countries where no law apply, with respect, for instance, to environment, or to labor laws. So Marie-Christine Dupuy-Danon, who worked for the UN, a French criminologist, said once, the problem nowadays when you manage a multinational corporation is not about asking yourself if what you want to do is illegal, but to ask yourself, where can I register an activity so that it becomes legal? Because like tax havens is sort of a menu in a restaurant where you choose where you register your company so that what you want to do becomes legal. It's like I call it tricher à la carte. So this is like one of the main problems that like it's not only about cheating on the tax perspective, it's also about having access to jurisdictions that allow you to become yourself as corporation sovereign, because that state won't ask you anything. So you become sovereign in these states as a corporation. The other aspect that is very important is that tax havens aren't related only to tax. It's about law. And what does it mean? It means that we should see tax havens, there are maybe 80, 90 of them. We should see them as like stores in a mall. When you go in a mall, it's not possible, you cannot imagine that in a mall you'll find stores that are all selling the same thing. Of course, they have specialties. It's the same with tax havens. Why you have so many tax havens is that they have their specialties. Like if you're a German taxpayer, you want to circumvent the tax system, you go to Liechtenstein. If you're a Canadian, you go to the Barbados. If you come from the US, the Cayman Islands are better. If you're French, you go to Switzerland. It was made to, it fits negatively with the country. But it's also about activities. If you want to hire children, you go to a free zone in Jamaica, in Bangladesh, in India, in Haiti, in China. Then you have no unions, you have no labor laws, you can do whatever you want. You pay $1 a day, workers that are desperate, remain desperate. And you circumvent all the, what unions obtained in the 20th century, making strikes and building a relationship with the capital. If it's about ships, if they have a Canadian flag or US flag or French flag, well, you have responsibility that come with that registration. You have to have 2 shelves. You have to make sure that you don't throw away on the sea toxic waste. You have to pay your sailors with respect to labor law, minimum wage, security laws. So if you change the flag and it's a Liberian flag, or a Jamaican flag, or a Panamanian flag, then everything disappears. And Paul Martin, the former Minister of Finance and Prime Minister of Canada, was the sole owner of a maritime transport company, the Canada Steamship Lines. And he had ships in Australia. And from one day to another, he changed the registration and he fired all the Australian sailors and replaced them by Ukrainian that were paid $1 a day and didn't pay tax because his international boats were managed from Bermudas, and the final structure was in the Barbados. So, and he was, meanwhile, Minister of Finance of Canada, responsible of the tax system here, asking people to pay their tax, their fair share of taxes. And when he was asked, well, how could he justify that? Fellow said, well, it's a blind trust. I mean, I don't know what's happening. I never phoned them. Like exactly what occurs with the actual federal Minister of Finance, William Morneau, which has interests in a structure that has his name and that has companies in the Barbados managed by a blind trust. They never called them. And even though he doesn't call them, maybe it's true, but he knows exactly in which framework that company may make money or not. I mean, if he tries hard to tackle tax havens, of course, it will be bad for his interest and the interest of the ruling class he belonged to. So, insurance company. Well, if you manage an insurance company, it's better to go to the Turk and Caicos Islands. They are specialized in that. So you have reinsurance. You don't have to respect the laws you'll have here. For finance, if you would like risky deals or risky investments, you go to the Cayman Islands where you have hedge funds. That's how we got into the subprime crisis in 2008. When an investor wants to create a mining company, they go to Canada. It's the world haven for the mining companies. They have all kinds of advantages. It would be a conference as such. 3 mining companies in the world out of 4 are Canadian. But they don't. The capital doesn't always come from here. You have Belgian investors, Frenchmen, people from Israel, from Australia, from the UK, from the US that create mining corporations in Toronto mainly to exploit ore elsewhere in the world, almost everywhere. I mean, you have thousands of Canadian mining companies in exploration mainly, but also in exploitation, having the support of this jurisdiction, saying, well, you can pretend whatever you want on the stock market. The rules are very laxist. You'll have the support of the state when it comes to attract investors, fiscal advantages, flow-through shares, all kind of programs. We'll put our public money in it too. You'll have the support of the diplomacy, and so on and so forth. Very, very strong jurisdiction in order to support the world mining companies. If you create an oil platform, the Marshall Islands are dedicated to that, like the BP scandal was related to the Marshall Islands in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's spam. Send spam by email, spam. Well, usually the companies are in St. Kitts and Nevis. It's the place to be. And I'm not talking about recycling, laundering, money related to drug trafficking. It's more Panama. So the problem is, whatever you do, when you're big, you'll find a jurisdiction that will allow you to bypass all kinds of public constraints. And it creates a specific kind of citizens. You have ordinary citizens, proletarian, and I put in that category the middle class, because the middle class is only proletarian with money, but it's a bit randomly. that have like their own states. Germany, those we know, those we talk about, Germany, Canada, Spain, Japan, Brazil. And the richest have their own network of countries. The Bermudas, Bahamas, and so on. And also jurisdiction within that, these traditional states. Like Canada is like a mixed country. It's at the same time a traditional country with a set of law that is like more or less a legal state. Make Canada a legal state. And within the jurisdiction you have holes, like in a specific sector. In Ireland it's the same thing, in Belgium. In the US you have like their state, like Delaware, yeah, Delaware in the States, that where half of the companies that are public are registered. But you go to Delaware, you won't find them. It's just a small building in which like a lawyer basically registered them, but they aren't, it's just a way to avoid laws. So arms dealing and so on. So it worked that way, and like just a classic example, Gildan. Gildan is a company that was created a few years ago in Quebec, and it was about reinvesting in textile in Montreal. It was seen as something totally courageous. So the people of Gildan had money from the Fonds de Solidarité of the FTQ. They had money from the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec. They also had investors. So they created jobs, as they promised, in the Republic of Dominica and in Bangladesh. So people there worked in conditions that we wouldn't want for our worst enemies. And so they could produce goods that were shipped in our markets by boats, by ships, in which you have Ukrainian sailors working for $1 a day with a flag of convenience. Those goods were sold on our market because people have more money here than elsewhere. And the profits were registered in the Bermudas. And all these setups were made by accountants and lawyers that were trained and formed in public institutions, in universities, financed by the governments, because they are taught that in their course. In commercial business schools, in law school, they will be taught that because it's meant to be legal. I'm talking a lot. So, what I would like to say to conclude, because I could talk about that for hours. This system has a lot of social costs. It costs us a lot. And if you're involved in politics, if you're activist, if you have access to public discourses, it's quite easy to find hooks to talk about the issue in a very concrete manner, because it costs us a lot. It's just not theoretical. There are 5 major costs for us that are directly affecting our lives. First of all, is the obvious thing that all these billions aren't taxed. So there's a gap in the public budget because we don't tax them. And since we don't tax, Canada made it legal for corporations to register abroad profits, so that among the 10 first countries in which Canadian corporations invest, you have 7 tax havens. The second country where Canadian corporations invest the most is the Barbados, after the US, before China, before Germany, before France. But it's incredible. They send like tens of billions of dollars there. Even though when you go there won't be the Olympic Games in 4 years. You don't know why. I mean, there's no purpose. It's just about like to bypass the fiscal system. So this is the first cost, but it's only the beginning. The second cost is what we call, I don't know if that word says something to you, dumping, competition. Instead of fighting these governments of these small islands, saying, Well, we think that that law is a way for you to manage the capital that is created at home, and we don't consider on a diplomatic level that you should vote that law. We're contesting that law, and there are ways to do that on the diplomatic level. They do as if it was sovereign countries that have right to vote these laws, and you have to compete with them. So New Brunswick, Ontario, Quebec, France, and all these jurisdictions will compete with the Bermudas. Even though here, with taxes, we have to support a social system, what the Bermudas don't do. And they let their population totally, they put them aside. They don't care about their own population. They only bother about international finance, global finance. So this is the second point, is that so we lowered the corporate tax rate since 1981. In 1981, a corporation in Canada would pay, if you consider also the provincial tax, about 50% of taxes. And of course they do it, because they benefit from the system. They have airports, road, university. I mean, the state provides them employees that are formed, that are skilled. So of course they pay for that. It's not free. So, but instead of paying for that, because we compete with Switzerland and with the Bermudas, then they lowered tax rate. At the federal level, it was 38% in 1981. Now it's 15%. Mm-hmm. And it's the same everywhere in the world. So it's always making the gap bigger in the public finance. Because then, since then, look at the spending cuts at CBC, for instance. It's directly related with the use from corporations of tax havens. They will always say, well, we don't have money anymore. We don't have money for hospitals, for schools, for roads, for anything we need. So on a social basis, public services, assistance system for the poor, so on and so forth. Nothing. Well, always less. This is a second cost. And the third cost is debt. Because at the end of the year, since we cannot balance the budget, what do? We borrow money to those that we don't tax anymore. And so everything is working upside down. Because of the service of debt, the interests, taxpayers are paying banks and also corporations that became banks, often in tax havens, to borrow so that these companies help them to balance the budget because they don't pay their fair share of tax. So we pay them. It's working upside down. And the fourth cost, it's all obviously spending cuts. So lack of services. Previously you had help for the homeworks of some children, then you don't have that anymore, so the parents must pay themselves. And so on and so forth. And this fifth cost, and there are others, but the fifth cost is the fees. We're not in the scope of public services anymore, but in governance. And we're not citizens anymore, we're our clients. They put that in our mind. You go to the hospital, you're a client. You take a public bus, you're a client. It means that you have to pay. When you're a citizen, you have a right. When you're a client, you're in a commercial relationship. You go to a public library, you're a client. What does it mean? And it's a cost too. So the way I put it in my small book on tax havens is that when you wait at minus 20, 40 minutes for a bus, it's because of tax havens. And if you need deeply a surgery in the hospital and you have to wait 8 months, it's because of tax havens. And if the building of the school of your children is not appropriate related to public health, it's also because of tax havens. It is the main issue. And I think that states could target, if we had serious chief of state, they would fight against tax havens on a diplomatic level and not make as if tax was only something technical that should be settled by the OECD and so on and so forth. But the problem is that tax havens were shaped by those who pretend to criticize them. I don't have time to talk about that, but the main tax havens I talk about are Canadian creations. Because in the 19th century, London asked, in sort of subcontract, Halifax bankers to take care of the financial aspect of the Caribbean colonies. So Canadian banks were already there in the middle of the 20th century when they became tax havens thanks to the Marshall Plan that created these euro dollars that were in circulation in the world without any kind of public control and supervision. So you had the opportunity to create those states where you could manage these euro dollars without any kind of supervision from a state. And Canadian bankers were there. So you have, like in the Bahamas, the Minister of Finance, it was Sir Stafford Sands that created those laws, supported by Donald Fleming, a former Minister of Finance under Diefenbaker. And that guy, Sir Stafford Sands, was at the same time Minister of Finance of the Bahamas and member of the board of the Royal Bank of Canada. And it's just an example. There are plenty of them in the book that got mentioned. So this is the main aspect, and if I may say a small word on New Brunswick, the funny thing about New Brunswick is that it is, I think, you could put it that way, the tax haven of a unique company or family. It's totally surprising. It's a case of its own. You have a tax haven that isn't related to that type of business or that type of activities or taxpayers according to the situation, but just it's the country of a company made for it. And you have I brought a book with me, but I won't have time to quote it, but a book about the situation here that we could summarize with the expression I've used. And the journalist, Diane Francis, isn't at all someone critic. It's just like obvious for her. It's just a description. It's not an accusation. So if we put things in the perspective of the global finance, what we can see with tax havens as a political tool on a rhetoric basis, it's about seeing tax havens as a way to raise awareness on several levels. And it was interesting with the Panama Papers, the offshore papers, it was interesting, Paradise Papers, and so it was interesting to see that topic may be transversal. You can have people having a small store being capitalists, not at all involved politically, very small businessmen and women, considering that it's not fair that like Tim Horton or Starbucks or Walmart may avoid the taxes they have to pay as a small bakery or a small shop. So you may have interest from their part, and also have extreme leftist activists that consider that the whole system is fixed, and that we should totally replace it. And in between, you have like scales, and the tax haven is a way to create coalitions. It's a thematic that helps us to create links, bridges with people that don't really totally think like us. And when I can be quite radical when I talk about politics, but I was in the center of the mobilization on tax havens in Quebec for at least, I could say, 10 years. That's why I wrote all those books, and I was as much as I could present in the medias, in demonstrations. And I always made sure I had a discourse that was opened. I didn't want to make the thematic something totally leftist so that it would put people aside. I sort of tend to demonstrate that tax havens show that the system doesn't work, that there's something really wrong in that, and there are levels. And we have to take people where they are. And it's a way to gain the attention of people to talk about tax havens because why? And that's why it's so interesting for us. Nobody can defend them. You cannot justify them. I mean, it's even if you're a liberal in the French meaning, if you're right-wing conservative and you consider that there's a state, the rule of law, everybody is equal in front of the law, well, why someone has a loophole, thanks to the Canadian government, to avoid the law that should apply to everybody? So they say, well, they create money, they create business. Well, no, at the end, they just take everything they want and they don't pay back. We pay for them, and we don't have the luxury to pay for billionaires. They cost us too much. So it's easy to talk about that in a few seconds, if you have only a few seconds. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was a bit too long, sorry.
You were a little over, but so interesting. Yeah.
If there's a publicly traded company, are there not rules in the stock market to prevent this from happening?
If they are public?
Yeah, the publicly traded companies that are overseen by the stock market.
Well, the shareholders usually ask them to use tax havens to avoid taxation so that the profits are higher. And it became legal. Why is it legal, for instance? There are plenty of reasons. It's very technical, but why?
If the money's in the Bahamas, it's not going to the shareholders.
Yes, it is. Because at the end of the year, well, take any company, let's say Bombardier or Monsanto, or at the end of the year, like Total, they will say, well, we've done this year like $14 billion of profit. What is this $14 billion of profit? It's the addition of everything, every amount of money the subsidiaries have. Like Google has, at the end of the year, $10 billion in the Bermudas. They're an employee that is working in that subsidiary. He must work hard to generate $1 billion of profit. So it's Stakhanov of Stalin. So, well, this billion is added to the global amount. And when the group global disclose information to shareholders saying, well, this is our profit this year, well, it's the addition of all the small structures, but this amount is related to no single bank account. It's just the addition of every single entity. But on the legal perspective, that corporation, Google, doesn't exist. The only thing that exists are the subsidiary, independent from one another on a legal basis. But the shareholders are the same for every single structure.
Can I ask you about Medivh within New Brunswick? Do you know what I mean by that? It's Medivh Blue Cross manages our ambulance New Brunswick, manages our seniors health program, a lot of the government health insurance, supplementary health insurance. Now it's branched into home care through extramural, but it's just I don't know what style of company or corporation, but they would say that they're a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
That they don't have profits, it's a private, they don't have profits, I'll stop with that. But when you look at it, like Blue Cross is some kind of like a parent company somewhere off, and obviously, in the States, it's huge. I mean, they have their own hospitals, whatever. But then there's this Atlantic Medivie Blue Cross, and then they manage these health service within the province, but then they've got this kind of side thing that money goes into a foundation. So what publicly they'll say is that, yes, we have our board of directors and we do all of our profits that come from managing these health services for us, that the government contracts for, goes into this foundation, puts money into research for children's health services, really good charitable development work. But it's like, that something's not right with that story, because every business wants to make money, as they should. What's going on?
No, it's interesting to see what's the percentage of the capital of the foundation that is really...
None of that's visible.
Yeah, but it's the question we should ask. Maybe the law for access to information could
that would be the capital for somebody right now.
Well, to know what is the percentage of the capital that is really invested in the cause, the causes, the programs the foundation is involved in. Is it like in the US, like when Microsoft has a foundation or Apple? Well, it's only 3% of the amount that is really invested in programs. So
what percentage of the overall
capital
for Medivie Atlantic or whatever it's called goes into that foundation?
No. When you take the budget of the foundation,
gotcha.
Maybe it's like 3% or 10%. So it means that the rest is just a capital. It's like putting money in the bank.
Just sitting there.
Yeah, and it's a way to avoid taxation.
Yeah, we asked that at public accounts, and my understanding was what they said was it's sitting there for other innovative ideas as they come. Because you need a certain amount of capital to be able to mobilize.
Yeah, and meanwhile they don't pay taxes.
Exactly. So, but would there be, is that how that manages? Is that?
Usually corporations that use tax havens are bigger. Like I would like to see what Blue Cross does worldwide. And the idea is not as easy as it was decades ago. So the idea more often than ever is to send invoice for royalties related to the use of a brand. For instance, Starbucks in the UK I was talking about. Well, likely the subsidiary of Starbucks in the Bermudas own the property right on the word Starbucks and on the logos, the green logo. So if you want to use that green logo as a subsidiary elsewhere in the world, you have to pay royalties to the subsidiary in the Bermudas. So what does say the Starbucks to the UK government? Okay, yes, I make plenty of money, but if you see the invoices that I receive from my neighbor company in the Bermudas, it's exactly the amount of the profit I would have made. So, but I had to buy the rights to use my brand. And that's how you have, at the end of the year, millions of dollars in the bank account of the Bermudian company. So that and in Canada, one of the first businessmen that did that is Irving. In the 70s, he sent his assets, the asset of his companies here to the Bermudas. And he could sell what he was producing on the first step was to sell what he was producing to the company that would sell that back elsewhere. I think it's a bit more complicated today. But I would like to know which exact company has the property right on the brand Irving.
It's in the trick is, because I did a little video on that, 10 steps to it. And one was, there's no law stating how much you're not allowed to pay, or how much you can pay for a logo for the brand.
Yeah.
So the brand belongs to the subsidiary in Bermuda. It's the same thing. They borrow money from their own bank in Bermuda, but there's no law that states that you can't pay more than 45% interest on the money you loan. So they determine the profit they made from extracting and processing our resources, and then make sure that the subsidiaries eat all that up. Okay, so, and in the case of Medavie is a private, non-profit company. So the way I understand it is that all the partners actually charge or bill Medavie, and at the end of the billing, although it's a private company, whatever profit they have, they give it to a non-profit organization. So it makes them look good.
Yes.
And then they can write off that on whatever tax, or they share it, or whatever. But it's not a non-profit company. The partners make their money, but it's billed from their companies in Bermuda. But it's all hidden that way. So it's just a play of words. We're a private, non-profit company delivering a service. Medavie actually has no equity. They have no buildings. They don't own the ambulances. The province provides all of that. They just exist to manage without actually owning any buildings.
And in this last contract, they've constructed, just like what you said about the royalties for any new learnings or new ways of dispatching or doing whatever, it's written in as what will be the cost share for the royalties and the intellectual property.
Yeah.
Will be forever theirs, whether the contract is continued or not continued.
In New Brunswick, we have ridiculous mining contracts. They want to open up the mine, the tungsten mine, for instance, at Sisson Brook. Well, in their contract, it states that the province will charge a set percentage, okay, based on their net profit, the mine's net profit. While in other jurisdictions, they actually charge a percentage on the value extracted. But in New Brunswick here, they've signed a contract with this company, but the company can manage to never show a profit, just like Irvings, right? So Irvings have 176 incorporated companies in New Brunswick, and not one manages to make money because, Jesus, the subsidiaries in Bermuda are just killing them. We're going to need more government subsidy just to keep going. That's what they've been.
And I like the expression, the play of words, because it's all about that. And one of the criticism I've made about the way we talk about tax havens is that you use words that are commonly used for like traditional business. And the problem is that using these words, that vocabulary, we launder the system with these words. It's not money laundering is something technical, but it's also something semantic. Like when the Canadian government, Statistics Canada provides data saying, well, there are direct foreign investment from Canadian corporations. It's not true. They are not investments, because when you just shift profit and bring them back, because Canada signed a treaty with the Barbados in 1980 that allowed corporations to do that, you're not investing. And when you see that it's a corporation, like an enterprise, they are doing nothing. And when you see afterward that they are, like in Cayman Islands, these charitable companies, they do nothing charitable. Like one of them leans airplanes to Air France. I mean, I know that we shouldn't judge about what is charity, but I mean, at that level, it's a bit strange for a choice. And it's always like that, like trusts. A trust means that you have money, you give that money to a structure that will manage it for a third party. Well, in these countries, the three players may be the same person. Well, it's not a trust anymore, don't call it that way. But the words are totally, are used in a Orwellian manner. And it doesn't help us at all. Even the expression tax haven. Tax haven is a recycling of the colonial aesthetic. When in the 19th century, Europeans were writing colonialist and racist novels about savages and like all these islands where you can do everything you want and there are cannibals and seductive women and all that kind of stories. Well, tax havens just recycled that aesthetic because often tax havens are former colonies. So you take that aesthetic with the exotic trees, the sand, the sun. It's all that. And we said they are havens. Yeah. And in French, they thought that havens were heaven, so they said paradis. It's a mistake they've made. And then the Germans said oasis, but in the same spirit. But it all looks alike.
There's no negative connotation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, we should. That's why I like libertarian state, accommodating states. I mean, we should have a technical way, at least, to describe what they are. And if, accommodating state would be the neutral expression, libertarian state a bit pejorative. Well, for us at least. But if you say tax haven, it's almost beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean.
Well, it's because taxes have been demonized.
Yeah,
Yes.
true.
And most people don't realize that we all receive $23,000 worth of benefits from our
I always
social
see,
contract.
like in the last election in Quebec, the party of François Legault was elected, and his ideology is to put money back in the pocket of the people. Well, you become poor if the money is in your pocket instead of in the bucket. Because if you put it in a pot, you can do more with that money than if you have to pay for everything from your wallet. I mean, but since decades, no political party supports the principle of taxes. It's always about paying less taxes, the carbon tax is the negative, everything is negative, and it's always, we come to the point where people don't even make the connection between taxes and the public budget. They don't make the connection. It's like two separate things.
I think part of that is that we've learned that multinationals are not paying anything.
No?
So when you or anybody talks to me about that,
Yeah.
the taxes I pay are important and we need to pay our fair share. Meanwhile, that multinational is paying zero,
Yeah.
and that's legislated, or that is seen as that's acceptable. So
Well, the discourse
within
then,
that
you're right.
narrative,
Yeah. Well,
I feel pissed off.
the discourse, when I go to it doesn't happen anymore, thank God, but when I had to go to right-wing radio shows, for instance, they were saying, well, we pay too much taxes are disgusting, and so on. I started to say, yeah, you're right, you're totally right, we're paying too much, but it's because some aren't paying their fair share. And if you put it that way, the idea is not that we should pay more, maybe we should pay less.
Yes.
But not because governments are too big, and no, because 40 years ago, we didn't have that problem. And also there's so silly propaganda, like saying that, I don't remember how it's called, but it's North America, there's in Europe too, I think there's a day called the day where you earn finally your first dollar, and it's in May. Well, no, it's not true. It's the day you become poorer. Well, it's important to have money in your wallet, but I mean, what you paid before wasn't thrown out of the window. I mean, and those people who cry because they pay to these right-wing libertarian, they are the first one. They have a small thing to go to the hospital and cry. They are the first one to call the police when whatever. I mean, they don't make the connection.
Tax Freedom Day.
Tax Freedom Day,
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah.
Fraser Institute.
Fraser Institute, you're right. Yeah.
Great
Oh.
left wing group.
At last, I earned my first dollar today. No, you'll become less and less richer starting today.
Do other people have questions? I'm just
Yeah.
conscious of the time, sorry.
I just have one quick question. I think I know the answers, but I'd like to hear from you. So Barbados, or whatever country is, you're saying they don't care about the people, but they're not helping and doing that? What are they getting out of it?
Yeah.
What's their benefit?
Why did it?
Well, it's not possible to ask a question on the formal point of view, like a state being represented by elected governments. Like, it has to be seen sociologically. On a formal point of view, they earn nothing. It's not about representing a state and common interest, and it's just about renting a sovereignty. That's it, and that's it for Canada with mining companies.
How can they
It's-
remain in power if they're not looking at?
Because they are related to lobby. Like take the Bahamas. They have the strength as a political entity of the Bathurst Municipal Council. So you have the biggest banks in the world that come there. They have relationships since centuries now, since 2 centuries. The population don't trust them at all. But don't go in an election, try to get elected. I mean, you just die. It's too dangerous. I mean, there's no room for you anyway. So everything is fixed. So it's like Sir Stafford Sands was Minister of Finance, Minister of Tourism, and member of the board of the Royal Bank of Canada at the same time. Minister of Tourism, he had relationship with the U.S. organized crime that was laundering money. Minister of Finance, he had access to, he was managing the laws related to euro dollars, all these dollars that will come from Europe that had this Marshall Plan. It was managed in the Bermudas, and himself was managing a bank. So the population are the last one to pay taxes in this country, and often it's on the borders, like on appelle ça les douanes, the customs. So they pay high, and it's an island. Often it's island, so they pay a lot. And if you want to read about that, there's a report from John Christensen called "The Offshore Crude." It says like the oil crude, the offshore crude. When a country becomes offshore, he himself comes from Jersey Island. When a country, he knows what he's talking about. He was a teenager when the Jersey Island became a tax haven, and he was clever. He studied in that field. He worked in banks and for the government to understand how it worked. He created himself offshore structures. And then when he understood well the system, he got out of it and he created the tax justice network, and he started to criticize the system. And that's why we are so well informed. It's because of that guy, John Christensen. And he worked a report called, and he prefaced my book. I was very pleased about that. And John Christensen said, they talked about offshore crude. Because when the banks arrive, you lose everything. They're like, you're like orphans on the political level. You don't have government anymore. Like New Brunswickans. I feel like in the tax haven here, like people don't have a government. You read Diane Francis in English or Michel Cormier in French, saying like a fact, like the law of gravity, no government can be created in New Brunswick if the Irving family disapprove it. We have here sort of an old-fashioned British governor that rules, but in an anonymous way, like in the informal way.
Feels like a feudal state.
Yeah, absolutely. It is.
Yes.
It is.
Yes, a feudal state.
Yeah, it's like, I was at, spoke about that this week, and I was talking about, I have the impression to travel in the time. And we're in the 19th century here. No antitrust law. Incredible. Well, I wrote in a book called the Pervert Totalitarian. Thank you. And yes, it's a way to see things like because here it's obvious there's a totalization of the control. Like I was talking about that. You go to the Beaverbrook Museum. Like right away, it's called Beaverbrook. Like it's mafia, like mafia museum. Same. You go inside and then you say, "Oh, there's a painting from Dali. That is interesting." So you see that there's a painting of Dali because the guy that is painted is a friend of the Irving and of Beaverbrook, and they bought the painting to show that they were painted by Dali. And that's why you can have access to a painting from Dali. It never stops. Like dogs that pee to establish their territory. I mean, they are everywhere. And at the end, I feel like in Tunisia with the Ben Ali family, they were everywhere just like that.
Merci. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.